A fuel depot outside Karsfeld Hollow, 1944. A thin girl in a patched coat walks through the checkpoint carrying a lantern, her eyes cast down. She looks harmless, exhausted, maybe 13. The guard waves her through without a second glance. She moves between the trucks, the tents, the stacked barrels of gasoline, invisible the way only broken village girls could be. She stops near the fuel line, raises the lantern, and lets it fall. Then she walks away as the night explodes behind her, steady, unhurried, while an entire Nazi battalion burns. Her name is Merwin Halevik. She's 14 years old, and 2 years ago, soldiers shot her father in the snow for a name on a list that never mattered. That battalion stored supplies meant for the Eastern Front. Weapons, ammunition, winter gear for thousands of troops. She didn't just kill men that night. She crippled an entire operation. When survivors whispered about what happened, no official report ever listed her name. They called it accidental ignition, blamed the weather, the equipment. They never suspected a child. This is the story of a girl who learned to listen to systems from her father, a girl who ran errands for the men who killed him, a girl who became a ghost in plain sight and answered silence with fire. Merwin Halevik was born in 1928 in the village of Karsfeld Hollow, where her father Edrin repaired radios and windmills and taught her that everything that controls us makes a sound. You just have to know when it's lying. Before we continue Merwin's story, let me ask you something. Those soldiers who shot an unarmed man in the snow, who laughed as they drove away, who made an entire village learn that noise invited death. Do you think they deserved what came for them in the fire? If you believe that evil doesn't get to sleep soundly, that occupation has a price, that girls like Merwin had every right to become the nightmare her enemies never saw coming. Hit that subscribe button right now. Smash the like button if you're ready to see how a 14-year-old turned invisibility into a weapon. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because stories like this deserve to be heard everywhere. Your support helps us bring more forgotten heroes out of the shadows. Now let's go back to 1942, to the day Karsfeld Hollow stopped making sounds. Edrin Halevik was the kind of man occupiers tolerate until they don't. He fixed radios the Germans confiscated and conveniently forgot to return. He repaired windmills for families whose sons had been conscripted or killed. He kept the village running in the small, invisible ways that made survival possible. And he whistled, constantly, defiantly, like the war was happening somewhere else. The whistling drove the soldiers mad, not because it was loud, but because it refused to acknowledge their power. A cheerful tune while rewiring a transmitter, a folk melody while greasing gears, songs that said, "You may occupy my village, but you don't occupy my throat." Merwin learned everything at his workbench. "Listen," he'd say, holding a broken radio close to her ear. "Hear that hum? That's the transformer lying. It says it's working, but it's dying." He'd tap the casing. Systems always tell you when they're failing. You just have to know what honesty sounds like. She learned to hear the truth beneath the noise, the grinding bearing in a windmill, the loose wire sparking in a circuit, the engine cough that meant a truck was burning oil. He wasn't teaching her repair work. He was teaching her how empires collapse. "Everything that controls us makes a sound," he told her one morning, hands black with grease. "Radio signals, truck convoys, guard rotations. Even silence is a sound if you know how to read it." She didn't understand then. She would later. The truck arrived on a Tuesday morning, engine sputtering in the cold. 3 soldiers climbed out. A 4th stayed inside, smoking. Edrin raised his hands before anyone spoke. "I repair voices," he said calmly, nodding toward the radios stacked inside his shed. "I don't send them." The officer checked a list, found his name. That was all it took. They shot him in the snow, 1 bullet, no ceremony, and drove away while the engine was still warm. Merwin stood in the doorway. She did not scream. The village had learned that screaming brought more boots, more trucks, more names added to lists. She watched her father fall and felt nothing, which terrified her more than grief ever could. That night alone, she buried him beneath the apple tree where he'd taught her to listen. No one helped. No one dared be seen with her. She placed his broken radio in the grave beside him. Inside the casing, she tucked the photograph she'd found in his coat, the one with the message on the back. "If they take me, listen to the silence." She finally understood what he meant. Silence wasn't the absence of sound. It was the space where vengeance learns to speak. After Edrin died, the village learned to look through Merwin as if she were glass. Not from cruelty, from survival. Association was dangerous. Grief was contagious. So neighbors crossed the street when they saw her coming. Shopkeepers served her without meeting her eyes. The baker left bread on her doorstep at dawn, gone before she could say thank you. She became a ghost in her own home. The house felt enormous now. Rooms that once hummed with her father's whistling stood silent. His workbench sat untouched, tools arranged exactly as he'd left them, waiting for hands that would never return. Broken radios lined the shelves like small coffins. Outside, the windmill he'd been repairing before they took him creaked uselessly in the wind, blades locked at odd angles, refusing to turn. Her mother had died when Merwin was 9. Fever, fast, and merciless. Back then her father's presence had filled the gaps, his songs, his lessons, his unshakable belief that broken things could be fixed. Now both parents were gone, and the silence was total. But Merwin didn't collapse into it. She sharpened herself on it. She began listening the way her father taught her, not to voices, but to systems. She learned the rhythm of German patrols, boots on cobblestone every 2 hours, like clockwork. She learned which engines belonged to supply trucks, which to officer transports. She learned that soldiers spoke louder when they felt safe, quieter when orders came from Berlin. She learned that silence had patterns, too. The village went quiet when executions were planned. Dogs stopped barking before raids. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath when something terrible was coming. Grief, she realized, was useless. It made you scream or cry or beg, and none of that changed anything. But observation, cold, patient, relentless observation, that was a language power didn't expect you to speak. She stopped crying at night. She stopped waiting for comfort that wouldn't come. She started cataloging which families still had sons, which houses hid food, which soldiers drank too much, which officers were careless. One evening, as winter deepened, she pulled her father's coat from the peg by the door. It smelled like oil and tobacco and the ghost of his last morning. It was too big for her, sleeves hanging past her wrists, hem dragging in the snow. She wore it anyway. Inside the pocket, her fingers found the photograph, the one with the message that had burned itself into her memory. "If they take me, listen to the silence." She finally heard what he'd been trying to tell her. Silence wasn't emptiness. It was a weapon waiting to be used. By the winter of 1944, the war had grown desperate enough to make men careless. The battalion arrived on a gray morning, a convoy of trucks coughing black smoke into the frozen air. They set up camp a half-mile outside Karsfeld Hollow, close enough to requisition labor, far enough to pretend the village didn't exist. Merwin watched from the tree line as the camp took shape. Canvas tents arranged in neat rows, fuel trucks parked in tight clusters, engines idling to keep the diesel from freezing, radio posts humming with static and distant voices, and barrels, dozens of them, stacked 3 high along the perimeter, close enough that you could walk from one end to the other and never lose the smell of gasoline. Her father would have called it a system waiting to fail. The Germans assumed Karsfeld Hollow was sufficiently broken. They'd executed enough fathers, confiscated enough food, silenced enough voices. A village like this didn't resist. It survived. It obeyed. It looked down when Boots approached. So when Merwin showed up at the checkpoint carrying laundry, eyes downcast, shoulders hunched against the cold, the guards barely glanced at her. "Water detail," one barked. "Then get out." She nodded, silent, and walked past them into the heart of the camp. Over the following weeks, she became part of the scenery, the thin girl in the oversized coat who hauled water, collected laundry, scrubbed pots, invisible in the way only the powerless could be. Soldiers barked orders at her, laughed over her head, talked as if she weren't there. She never spoke unless spoken to. She never looked anyone in the eye. But she noticed everything. The guards rotated every 6 hours, always in pairs, always bored. The fuel truck stayed running because the cold made engines hard to restart. The barrels were stored closer together after the first snowstorm. Easier access, someone had decided. The radios crackled loudest when the wind came from the east. The officers drank in the command tent every night after reports were filed. Most importantly, she noticed the gaps. No one checked her basket when she left. No one counted how long she stayed. No one questioned why a village girl would volunteer for work that paid nothing. They weren't guarding against someone they couldn't imagine. 14-year-old with dirt under her nails and her father's coat hanging to her knees. Someone who'd learned to listen to systems. Someone who knew exactly what sound failure makes. One night, walking back through the checkpoint with an empty basket, Merwin allowed herself the smallest ghost of a smile. They had built their camp like men who believed they'd already won. She would teach them what silence sounds like when it answers back. She found it on a Tuesday, while sorting through a pile of German laundry that reeked of diesel and sweat. Her hand brushed the inner pocket of her father's coat, the one she wore every day now, its weight a kind of armor, and felt something stiff, wedged deep in the lining, a tear in the seam, something hidden. She pulled it out carefully. A photograph, creased and faded. 2 men standing side by side, younger than she remembered her father ever being. Adrian on the left, smiling in a way she'd almost forgotten he could. The other man she didn't recognize, dark hair, sharp eyes, the kind of face that looked like it knew how to disappear. She flipped it over. On the back, in her father's careful script, "If they take me, listen to the silence." Her breath caught. This wasn't a goodbye note scribbled in panic. This was planned, written long before the truck arrived. Before the list, before the bullet. Edrin had known. Maybe not the day, not the hour, but he'd known they would come for him eventually, and he'd prepared her without ever saying the words aloud. Suddenly everything recontextualized. The lessons at the workbench weren't just about radios. They were about infrastructure, vulnerability, how systems lie when they think no one is listening. His insistence that she learn the sounds of engines, guard rotations, fuel lines. It wasn't casual teaching. It was training. His calm the morning they came for him. Hands raised, no fear. I repair voices. I don't send them. Not a defense, a message for her. So she would know. He'd chosen this. He'd stayed visible so she could learn to be invisible. Her father hadn't been a victim. He'd been a soldier in a war she hadn't understood she was inheriting. Merwin stared at the photograph until her vision blurred, but no tears came. Grief had already done its work. What she felt now wasn't rage or sorrow. It was clarity, cold, sharp, absolute. She tucked the photograph back into the coat's lining and returned to the camp with her basket of clean laundry. This time, she didn't just observe. She tested, walked closer to the fuel barrels than necessary, watched how the guards didn't react, noted the way snow had drifted against the stacked drums, melting where engines leaked warmth, saw how the tents were anchored with rope that frayed in the wind. The camp wasn't fortified, it was convenient, and convenience, her father had taught her, was just another word for vulnerable. That night, lying awake in the empty house, she whispered into the dark, "I'm listening, Papa." The silence answered back. Knowing how to destroy something is not the same as choosing to. Merwin lay awake for 3 nights, staring at the ceiling beams, running through the consequences like her father counting circuit failures. If she acted, they would retaliate. Not against her. She'd be ash or gone, but against Karsfeld Hollow. They would line up families in the square, burn homes, hang anyone whose name appeared on the wrong list or no list at all. The village had already learned to survive by disappearing. What she was considering would make them visible again, and visibility meant death. She thought of the baker who left bread on her doorstep, the woman who'd once braided her hair before her mother died, the boy 2 houses down who still nodded at her when no one was looking. If she lit that match, she'd be killing them too. She almost stopped, almost buried the idea with her father beneath the apple tree and spent the rest of the war as a ghost, invisible and harmless. Then she returned to the camp on Thursday, and a new soldier was stationed at the checkpoint. Young, nervous, eyes that actually focused. "You," he said, stepping in front of her. "I haven't seen you before." Her heart slammed against her ribs, but her face stayed empty. She kept her eyes down, basket clutched against her chest. "Laundry," she whispered. "I come every week. Who authorized this?" She didn't know. She'd never needed authorization. She just came, and no one cared. The soldier stared at her, thin, hollow-eyed, drowning in a dead man's coat. A village girl worn down to nothing. Exactly what occupation looked like when it succeeded. He waved her through. "Make it quick." She walked past him on legs that barely held her weight, realizing with perfect, terrible clarity she had survived because she was exactly what they expected. Broken, harmless, beneath notice. That was her power, and it would only work once. That night she stood in her father's workshop holding the old lantern he'd used for late repairs. Dented, functional, ordinary. It wasn't a weapon. It was a question she was asking herself. Do the dead deserve an answer? Outside the wind shifted. She could smell snow coming. She chose the night it would fall hardest, when guards would huddle close to fires, when visibility dropped, when the camp would be focused inward on warmth instead of outward on threats. She chose the night they would never see her coming. The night she chose, the sky hung low and bruised with snow that hadn't fallen yet. Merwin walked through the checkpoint carrying the lantern in both hands, flame guttering behind scratched glass. The guard glanced at her, recognized the coat, the downcast eyes, the exhaustion. He waved her through without a word. She didn't hurry. Hurrying drew attention. Hurrying suggested purpose, so she moved through the camp the way she always did, slow, aimless, invisible, just another shadow among the tents and trucks. Around her, the battalion hummed its evening rhythm, engines idling against the cold, that low mechanical growl she'd memorized weeks ago. Radios crackling with static and distant voices coordinating movements she'd never see. Men laughing in the command tent, the clink of bottles, someone singing off-key, life pretending it would continue. She passed a soldier warming his hands over a barrel fire. He didn't look up. She walked between two fuel trucks, their engines throbbing, heat into the frozen air. No one stopped her. She reached the fuel line, the main artery feeding the entire depot, and set the lantern down carefully. Her hands were steady. That surprised her. She'd expected them to shake. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. 10 seconds where she could still walk away, pretend she'd only been delivering something, become invisible again. Let the war continue without her. 10 seconds where her father's voice whispered in her memory. Everything that controls us makes a sound. She lifted the lantern and let it fall. The glass shattered. Fire met gasoline. The world didn't explode. It answered. A sound like air being ripped open, bright and furious, crawling up the fuel line faster than thought. Fire leapt to the nearest barrel, then the next, sound answering sound, assumption collapsing into chaos. Men started shouting, but their voices were already irrelevant. Tents ignited like paper. Engines screamed as fuel tanks ruptured. Ammunition cooked off, in sharp, desperate cracks. The careful architecture of occupation, so organized, so confident, unraveled into something primal and ungovernable. Merwin turned away before the first bodies fell. She didn't run. Running was noise. She walked, steady, purposeful, toward the tree line while orange light climbed the sky behind her, and the battalion dissolved into fire and screaming and the terrible realization that they'd been wrong about everything. No one saw her leave. By the time they thought to look for saboteurs, she was already gone. A ghost walking into darkness, snow beginning to fall, erasing her footprints as if she'd never existed at all. Behind her, the camp burned. Ahead, the forest waited. And somewhere in the smoke and chaos, a system that believed itself untouchable, learned what silence sounds like when it finally speaks. By dawn, the camp was ash and twisted metal. The surviving soldiers stumbled through the wreckage, faces black with soot, eyes wide with the kind of confusion that comes when certainty burns. Officers barked orders no one followed. Radio operators tried to explain the unexplainable to commanders 100 miles away, who demanded facts that didn't exist. What happened? No one knew. A fuel leak, someone said. The cold made the seals brittle. Sabotage, another insisted. Partisans must have infiltrated. But how? The checkpoint had been manned all night. No one had come through who wasn't authorized. No strangers, no suspicious activity. Just the usual laborers. The broken villagers who hauled water and scrubbed pots and kept their eyes down. The official report, filed 3 days later and stamped with bureaucratic efficiency, listed the incident as accidental ignition due to equipment failure and adverse weather conditions. No names, no suspects, no investigation. Because the alternative, that they'd been destroyed by someone they never considered a threat, was unthinkable. In Karsfeld Hollow, the villagers waited for the reprisal that always came. They boarded windows, hid valuables, rehearsed explanations for crimes they hadn't committed. Parents held children closer. The baker stopped leaving bread. The streets went quieter than they'd ever been, even in occupation. But the trucks never came. No soldiers lined them up in the square. No homes were burned. No lists were read aloud. The Germans withdrew what remained of the battalion and never spoke of it again. Because an accident required no revenge. An accident was no one's fault. An accident let them save face while they buried their dead and pretended a girl in an oversized coat hadn't just crippled a supply line that was supposed to feed the Eastern Front. Merwin didn't return to the camp. She didn't boast or confess or leave signs. She went back to being what she'd always been. No one. The orphan in the too big coat. The girl whose father died for nothing. The shadow people had learned to look through. No celebration awaited her. No gratitude. No acknowledgement. The village never asked what happened that night, because asking meant knowing, and knowing made you complicit. So Merwin Halavik was erased, not by the Germans but by the silence that had always defined survival. She disappeared into it completely. A ghost who'd burned a battalion and left nothing behind but a story no one dared to tell. Not a hero, not a villain, just a girl who understood what her father tried to teach her. Systems collapse when someone finally stops pretending they're powerless. And sometimes the loudest answer is the one no one hears coming. 43 years after the fire, a graduate student named Klaus Brenner arrived in what used to be Karsfeld Hollow with a metal detector and a list of unmarked graves. The village had been abandoned after the war. Too many ghosts, people said. Too much silence that felt like judgment. Nature had reclaimed most of it. Foundations crumbled beneath moss. Roads disappeared under wildflowers. The church stood roofless, open to the sky, but the apple trees still grew. Klaus found the grave beneath the oldest one, its roots wrapped around something that made his detector scream. He dug carefully. A radio casing, corroded but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow survived decades of rot. A photograph. 2 men, younger than the war that killed them, standing side by side. On the back, written in faded but careful script, "He taught me how systems lie." Below that, in different ink, added later, by H, 1944. Klaus cross-referenced German battalion records. Found the incident. Report, accidental ignition, equipment failure, no suspects. He found survivor testimonies that mentioned rumors, whispers of a girl, a lantern, something the official reports refused to say aloud. He wrote a paper. It was dismissed as speculation. Circumstantial. The photograph proved nothing except that someone had buried a radio and a memory. History prefers its heroes documented, its villains named, its narratives clean. Merwin Halavik remained a footnote, a maybe. A ghost story told by survivors who died decades ago without ever speaking her name aloud. But Klaus visited the grove one more time before he left. The apple trees were old now, gnarled and stubborn, their branches heavy with fruit no one harvested. He stood beneath them as the sun set and the wind shifted, carrying the smell of earth and blossoms and something older than memory. That's when he heard it. Faint, distant, almost imagined. A whistle, not a bird, not the wind through branches, but a tune, jaunty, defiant, human, carried through the silence like a voice refusing to fade. Klaus turned, searching for the source, but the grove was empty. Just trees, just wind, just the ghost of a girl who'd learned that power doesn't always announce itself with fire and screaming. Sometimes it simply walks into the dark. Sometimes it refuses to disappear, even when history tries to erase it. Sometimes it becomes the silence that outlives empires, the kind that waits, patient and unforgiving, until someone finally learns to listen. And in the space between what's recorded and what's remembered, Merwin's answer still echoes. Not all battles are loud. Some burn quiet, and the ones that matter most are the ones they never write down. Power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a girl in an oversized coat who learned to listen when everyone else looked away. Stories like Merwin's don't trend, don't go viral, don't get Hollywood endings, but they're the ones that matter most. Subscribe to keep these voices alive. Hit that like button if this moved you. And see that video on your screen? Click it now. Because history has more ghosts worth remembering, and this next one will leave you speechless.